Use the teleport button to move forward into the chapel. Depending on your controller configuration, you can adjust the direction you'll be facing when you teleport, as shown by the arrow on the floor. Feel free to move around during your tour to get a better vantage point. Go ahead and try this now. We will begin shortly. You are standing in a virtual recreation of the Sistine Chapel. You have just walked through the entrance and are experiencing the work as the artist intended. This is how it was first seen by the people of Rome in December 1512. In our time, roughly 20,000 tourists a day are herded through this room, entering from a small door on the altar wall and exiting through a side door that will be installed in the 19th century. It is overwhelming. The mind reels. It's hard to focus on any one thing as you crane your neck and succumb to sensory visual overload. It was the German poet Goethe who said, "Until you have seen the Sistine Chapel, you can have no adequate conception of what one man is capable of accomplishing." Above you is over 6,000 square feet of painted fresco, largely created by one man. A man who didn't even want this job. Michelangelo Buonarroti, at age 33, was considered the greatest living sculptor after his creation of statues like the Pietà and the David. Some considered him the greatest living artist, period. One of these admirers was Pope Julius II. His uncle, Sixtus, had built this very chapel that bears his name when he was pope. At the time, the ceiling above you was covered in bright blue ultramarine paint with thousands of small gold stars. Pope Julius decided that he would add to his uncle's chapel and decorate its ceiling. He convened his Vatican artists to devise a plan. The artists, namely Donato Bramante, realized that this was going to be an extremely difficult task. He told Julius that he should award the ceiling commission to Michelangelo, the young sculptor from Florence. If he was indeed the greatest artist of our time, he would have no problem completing this commission. Unfortunately for Michelangelo, but fortunately for us, the Pope was convinced. All Bramante and his artist friends had to do was sit back and watch Michelangelo fail. Michelangelo pleaded with the Pope. He was a sculptor, not a painter. He had no experience painting fresco, but the Pope didn't care. So Michelangelo fled Rome, and the Pope sent an envoy to hunt him down and bring him back. When he refused, the ambassador said he would either decorate the Pope's ceiling or risk the invasion of Florence, his hometown. Needless to say, back then you didn't say no to the Pope. The ceiling above you took 4 years to complete, from 1508 to 1512. This includes a brief meltdown in the middle where he again fled and again was brought back under guard by armed papal soldiers. During this time, Michelangelo painted the entire ceiling you see, everything from the top of the windows up. Let me remind you, it took Leonardo 6 years to complete this, which I'm placing here at actual size. Seriously. Michelangelo was originally commissioned to paint the 12 apostles over the windows, and some elaborate geometric designs above their heads filling the vault. This was a Herculean task, not just painting a huge curved vault 70 feet off the ground, but dealing with ever-changing sight lines that, from the floor, presented almost impossible problems of perspective and foreshortening. Michelangelo was not one to be intimidated by difficulties. He preferred them, sought them out, at times even created them. He told the Pope that the existing plan was boring, and he would come up with something new. If he was going to do something, he was going to own it. So here's this young guy who doesn't want the job, who isn't trained to do the job, but reluctantly accepts the commission and then decides to completely alter it to an unheard of level of ambition never before seen, not even in antiquity. So Michelangelo decides that the chapel as it exists now, with its Quattrocento frescoes on the walls depicting the lives of Moses and Christ, what is missing is everything that came before. He will literally paint biblical Genesis surrounded by the Old Testament prophets and pagan Greek symbols who foretold the coming of Christ. In the four corners, he will depict Old Testament Jewish heroes overcoming their enemies. He painted over 300 figures encased in this fictional painted architectural scheme, the first of its kind, that serves to unify and harmonize everything into a single coherent cosmic whole. Unsure of himself, Michelangelo had assembled a team of experts to help him. He started right above where you entered the chapel, painting the Great Flood and the prophet Zechariah. After having painted Zechariah, which is believed to be a portrait of Pope Julius himself, the Pope was very pleased. He said it was a superb work and that Michelangelo could decorate the rest of the chapel in any manner he wished, effectively silencing disgruntled papal scholars alarmed at his plan to decorate their most holy chapel with pagan images. The Vatican artists, upon seeing this portrait, ridiculed Michelangelo, saying that he did not know foreshortening or perspective, that he was essentially a fool. I'd like you to take a minute to look down the room at Jonah, who caps the other end of this vault. He leans backwards in his throne, but the vault is actually curving forwards. He stretches his legs out into the real space of the chapel. He and Haman to his left are two of the most virtuoso examples of foreshortening in the history of art. But let's get back to the flood. The scaffold had been disassembled, and viewing it from the ground for the first time, Michelangelo was very disappointed. Here, he had hired the best fresco painters in Italy, and under their guidance, he had created figures that were hardly discernible from the floor. He started to doubt himself. Perhaps Bramante and the others were right. Never one to waste energy on confrontation, though, he arrived the next morning and locked everyone out. Save for a few Florentine friends to aid him with preparations, he would do the rest himself, and the doors would remain locked. You'll notice that from here down the vault, the figures become larger. They all exist in 3 dimensions, as though they are occupying space amid the marble architecture. This is a sculptor painting. There are no lush environments or backgrounds, no incidental details whatsoever. These are massive giants, looming figures that demand our attention as individuals. Let's go over the central flattened section of the vault. What's depicted are the first 9 verses of Genesis, starting at the altar wall with God separating light from darkness and ending above you with the drunkenness of Noah. This is the biblical narrative, painted in reverse order, from sin to salvation. You have the fall of Noah, and you follow this back across 3 organized groups, portraying Adam and Eve and God creating the earth. Remember, the guy hesitant to paint 12 apostles has now decided to depict the creation of the entire universe. Notice this large marble fence erected on the floor, the transept. It was meant to divide members of the Vatican from the visiting faithful. If you look up, see how this feature divides the biblical narrative. God is only portrayed on the liturgical or Vatican side and does not cross over into the lay area of the room to mingle with us common folk. Flanking the biblical histories are the giants we spoke of, the Old Testament prophets and pagan sibyls who foretold the coming of Christ. They are superhumans that exist on a plane between God and the lower figures surrounding them. Those figures, in the triangular spandrels and rainbow-shaped lunettes above each window, are the ancestors of Christ. These are some of the most profoundly human images ever painted. This concludes our brief orientation. Now that you have your bearings, the trigger on the control in your hand will allow you to inspect figures and elements on the ceiling. When one is highlighted, press the trigger to start or stop hearing information about that selected item. You can move freely around the floor of the chapel, or select the aerial work platform in the corner to hop in and take a closer look like a Vatican conservator. To learn more about the creation of the Sistine ceiling, select the wooden scaffold in the opposite corner. We hope you enjoy this experience as much as we enjoyed making it. Above you is a recreation of the original wooden scaffold, designed by Michelangelo. He was an amazing architect, creating, amongst other things, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, which is still the tallest dome ever built. He created the scaffold in a way that allowed him to move and extend it along these wooden beams resting on the wall cornice. This was such a pragmatic design that 500 years later, the team that set out to restore the ceiling actually recreated this exact same scaffold to do their work, but out of steel this time. Hold on, we're going to teleport up onto the scaffold where you can take a look. For 4 years, Michelangelo lived up here. He had assistants bring and mix paint, prep plaster. He ate here. He no doubt spent many nights sleeping on this scaffold. He had special candles that let off minimal smoke made of animal fat so that the wax burnt instead of dripping. I guess that's kind of important when you have one tied to your head. Take a moment to reach up and pretend to paint something above you. Your neck is probably already aching from looking up the past few minutes. Now think about painting like this day after day for 4 years. We not only know how long Michelangelo spent on the scaffold, we know the exact order in which he painted the ceiling, down to how much work he accomplished in a single day. How do we know this? Because in order for pigments to bind to fresco for all eternity, in order for the colors to become part of the stone, you have to paint plaster while it's wet. This is a huge time constraint to something that's already stressful enough. The amount of wet plaster you can paint in a day is called a giornata, and these giornata, or individual sections of plaster, could be seen when inspecting the ceiling closely. Take a look above you at the creation of Adam. It's 16 giornata in total. Let's look at the plaster sections. Sampling how the plaster of each section overlaps with the previous, we know the exact order these sections were painted. Let's fade in each section as he painted it in those 16 days. If I had the time, I could do this for every inch of the ceiling. We could fade in each day's work, starting above the door where you entered and progressing over the entire ceiling in the exact order he painted it, all the way to the altar wall and then finally the lunettes. We have so much detailed insight into the time and anguish he spent up here, largely because of this letter, a poem that he sent to a friend. In it, he describes the working conditions and even sketched himself painting the ceiling in the margins. I will leave you with this, his own words, but you can click on the floor at any time to head back down. I've grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat in Lombardy, or anywhere else where the water's a stagnant poison. My stomach squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing at heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket. My breast twists like a harpy's. My brush, above me all the time, dribbles paint onto my face and makes a fine floor for the droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts. My poor ass strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loose below me. My spine's knotted and folding all over itself. I'm bent taut as a Syrian bow. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy, perfidious tripe. Anyone shoots badly through a crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. Defend it from me, Giovanni. Protect my honor. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter. These Quattrocento frescoes were painted when Michelangelo was a young boy, completed by some of the most famous early Renaissance artists in Italy. As I mentioned before, they depict the life of Moses and Christ and existed here when he began the ceiling project. Michelangelo put a lot of thought into how his work above would tell the tale of everything that came before. This experience isn't really about these frescoes on the walls, but if you click them, I'll tell you the title of the piece and the artist who created it. This is The Legacy and Death of Moses by Signorelli. This is The Punishment of Korah by Botticelli. This is The Handing Over of the Tablets of the Law by Rosselli. In 1522, the architrave over this main door gave way just after the Pope had entered the chapel. It crushed and killed 2 guards and destroyed the 2 Quattrocento frescoes by Ghirlandaio and Signorelli that were originally here. These 2 later frescoes that replaced them are the discovery of the body of Moses and the resurrection of Christ. This is The Last Supper by Rosselli. This is Delivery of the Keys by Perugino. This is The Sermon on the Mount by Rosselli. This is The Calling of the First Apostles by Domenico Ghirlandaio. Young Michelangelo actually apprenticed for Ghirlandaio in his studio, and this is maybe the only time Michelangelo would have ever worked on a fresco was under his tutelage. This is The Temptations of Christ by Sandro Botticelli. This is The Baptism of Christ by Perugino. This is The Journey of Moses in Egypt by Perugino. This is The Events in the Life of Moses by Sandro Botticelli. This is Moses' Passage of the Red Sea by D'Antonio. This is The Handing Over of the Tablets of the Law by Rosselli. "25 years after completing the ceiling, Michelangelo did paint this entire altar wall, the Last Judgment. He was a 67-year-old man, and many of his contemporaries, including Julius, had passed. It shows Judgment Day as Christ the Redeemer casts the souls to hell and elevates the saved to heaven. The focus of this experience was on the ceiling, and it'd be a fool's errand to attempt to cover the altar wall at the same time. To explore the Last Judgment in detail, please download the experience when it's publicly available. Click on the altar wall once more to hear one of my favorite brief descriptions of the Last Judgment from renowned art historian Romain Rolland. It is dangerous to attempt to describe the Last Judgment. It is indeed impossible. Analyses and commentaries have been multiplied, but they kill the spirit by taking it in detail. We must face the vision squarely and lose ourselves in the abyss of that spirit. It is terrifying, and if regarded calmly, incomprehensible. It must be hated or adored. It stifles and excites. There is no nature, no landscape, no atmosphere, no tenderness, almost nothing human. The symbolism of a primitive and the science of a decadent. An architecture of naked, convulsed bodies, a barren, savage, and devouring thought, like a south wind over a sandy desert. There is no corner of shade, no spring to slake the thirst. It is a whirling spout of fire, the vertigo of a delirious emotion, with no goal except the God in which it loses itself. The whole calls on God, fears him, and proclaims him. A whirlwind blows across this throng of giants, the same whirlwind which sweeps through space, the God who has created the sun and hurled it like a ball of fire into the ether. There is no escape from the groaning of the tempest which surrounds and deafens you. Either you must hate this brutal force or abandon yourself to it without resistance, like the souls of Dante whirled along by an eternal cyclone. When we realize that hell was, for 4 years, the very soul of Michelangelo, we understand why his life was burnt out by it, and why for a long time afterward he remained like a soil, exhausted by too much use and no longer productive. Romain Rolland, 1905. These cherubs, the pendentives in the four corners, show Old Testament Jewish heroes overcoming their enemies. These are some of the most difficult surfaces to paint on. They essentially blend the walls and the ceiling together in the corners into one curving organic shape. You can now click on individual pendentives to learn more about them. This depicts the punishment of Haman. This is the story of Esther. As Queen of Persia, she interceded with the king to prevent the massacre of the Jewish people. Like on the entrance wall, breaking with tradition, Michelangelo depicts the story of a Jewish heroine on equal footing. The Persian king's chief minister, Haman, manipulated the king to make a decree that all Jews in the Persian Empire should be massacred. Esther's father, who was his enemy, was to be the first. Little did he or anyone know, Esther, the queen, was a Jew. She pleaded with the king and convinced him of the plot. Instead, we see Haman crucified on the cross that was prepared for Esther's father. The crucifixion of Haman is often referred to as the moment of salvation of the Jewish people. It's interesting that Michelangelo has chosen to crucify him on a tree because in the Bible he was hung from a tree. It's believed that this kind of alludes to Christ's crucifixion, which the Christians believe will be for the salvation of the entire world. It also allowed for some really virtuoso foreshortening. Here we see the punishment of the Israelites for turning their back on God and Moses. God has released a plague of poisonous snakes that engulfs the entire right side of the pendentive. Here we see a mass of bodies writhing in pain, fighting off the poisonous snakes. On the furthest right, a snake is devouring a guy's entire head while he's alive. This seems to have gotten their attention, and the Israelites pleaded with Moses to talk to God and have him put an end to it. God told Moses to fashion a brazen serpent wrapped around a staff. Whomever looked upon it would be healed. On the left, you see those Israelites looking upon it and being healed. Nothing like being poisoned and eaten alive by snakes to convince the faithful. That same bronze snake, wrapped around a staff, has become the worldwide icon of healing. This depicts Judith beheading Holofernes. The story of Judith may have been stripped from the Bible, voted out sometime in the early days of the church, but here Michelangelo presents Judith as David's full equal. Holofernes was an Assyrian general, and Judith was a beautiful widow. The Assyrians were camping outside the gates of her city, planning to burn the city to the ground the following day. At night, Judith snuck past the guards and went to Holofernes' tent. Once there, she seduced him. He drank too much wine and passed out. She then cut off his head and hung it from the gates. In the morning, the Assyrian troops, seeing their leader's head, panicked and fled. On the vault, you see Judith with her maidservant carrying off his head, while Holofernes' decapitated body sits in the background. There's also a guard sleeping in the upper left. This depicts David killing Goliath, a very well-known biblical story where the Israelites and Philistines are embroiled in war. The Philistines offer to end it all in a one-on-one showdown, a fight to the death between the best warrior from each army. The Philistines have their massive giant named Goliath, and the Israelites have, well, no one. David, a teenager, can't believe his fellow soldiers have so little faith in God, and he takes on Goliath with only a sling. Most stories have that single rock from the sling killing Goliath. However, Here Michelangelo shows that the stone only knocked the giant down. As he shakes it off and begins to rise, David climbs on him and takes Goliath's own sword. Grasping him tightly by the hair, he pulls his head back. And this is how we find them. David, at that decisive moment before bringing the sword down on the giant's massive neck. Definitely a nod to Judith across the way. Here, painted at the same time as the Quattrocento frescoes below them, are 28 predecessors to Pope Sixtus, each tucked away in his own false niche. Because the primary function of the chapel was to be the room where cardinals would elect a new pope, I suppose it made sense to have someone paint a history of popes. That said, these guys are easily the least photographed and discussed items in this room. What's depicted in the areas above the windows, the lunettes, is an unbroken genealogical succession from altar to entrance, showing the ancestors of Christ as listed in the first book of Matthew. For hundreds of years, these windows were almost black with soot, causing even the most renowned and celebrated historians to call this the zone of darkness and death. When it was cleaned, what was revealed were, as I said, some of the most profound and gentle depictions of humanity in the history of art. The historian and philosopher Will Durant said Michelangelo surpassed antiquity in that he had infused the human form with struggle and awareness of grace amid suffering, and above all, an imperishable soul. These are Renaissance people going about their daily lives. Again, Michelangelo broke with tradition, including women equally in these works. Mothers tending to their infants, seamstresses cutting cloth, another spooling thread. There are figures writing down thoughts, old men huddled in robes for warmth. There are people resting, literally falling asleep up in the architecture. Some of my favorites are The Woman by Amenadab, who's combing her long hair, or Boaz, with his crazy beard looking mockingly face to face with his own portrait, carved in his walking stick. Then there's the mother of Jesse. She's the only figure on the ceiling looking out directly at us. Her haunting and piercing stare is now even more unsettling after the Vatican restoration left her with empty, eyeless, and hollow sockets. This will forever be a reminder of our own hubris. These cherubs, referred to in Italian as putti, or by Michelangelo as termini, hold up the lintels and create a strong architectural frame around the prophets and sibyls. In the faux architecture, they project out very far away from the plane of the ceiling, almost as far as the prophets and sibyls themselves. There are 48 putti in total. Each prophet and sibyl is framed with a pair to each side. Each pair were created by mirroring 12 distinct cartoons or drawings. In each pair, there is a male and female cherub. Though male putti were common in Renaissance painting, it was very rare to depict a female. There are actually only 2 other known cases in all Renaissance art up until this moment. So here, once again, Michelangelo broke with tradition in his inclusion and portrayal of women. This is God separating light from darkness, the act he did on the first day of creation. It's worth noting that God is creating here in a very similar fashion to how Michelangelo painted the ceiling, standing, working with his hands far above his head. These 20 figures of nude young men, the ignudi, are seated above the prophets and sibyls, one layer closer to God, and represent wingless angels, the ideal human figure. They adorn the architecture, positioning those medallions in place along with massive sacks of acorns. Oak being the symbol of the Della Rovere family, which means of the oak, This is the house of Julius and Sixtus, the popes we spoke of earlier. Here we see God creating the sun and moon in one grand gesture. He's soaring to and fro through the air. This is a very interesting take on God. In Renaissance art, you would never really see God flying through a ceiling, much less see his backside and the bottoms of his feet. Note the forceful determination on his face as he hurls the sun out into the ether. Framing this panel, the two Ignudi are caught up in a gale of force. One is cringing from the ball of fire, and the other is bracing himself as not to be blown off the ceiling. This depicts the separation of sky and water. God floats here, arms posed in another grand gesture. He's reaching out across the frame, almost seems to be blessing the world he's created, preparing it for man. This is the creation of man, perhaps the most famous image in human history. It depicts God creating man, this beautiful creature, in his own image. When the papal soldiers dragged Michelangelo back to finish the second half of the ceiling, this was the first thing that he painted. He's moving fast. He painted the remaining part of the vault in just 7 months. From here on out, he just wants to get the project done. Adam reaches forward, but looks past God into the eyes of the yet-to-be-created Eve. She is peering back at Adam from the shielded safety of God's left arm, which she clutches. Eve looks directly into the eyes of Adam. On the right, God's arm and hand reach towards Adam in order to impart the charge of life. But the fingers do not touch. The space between them is the substrate of all faith and all doubt. It represents the leap from the visible to the invisible, but also demonstrates visually an incomplete theological resolution. Man must imagine God, not the other way around. This entire scene gravitates around God's gesture. He is bringing Eve forth from the side of Adam, who is fast asleep. There's this great expression of slack-jawed amazement and wonder on Eve's face as she stumbles forward like some kind of adult newborn. I love God's pose here, his arm gesture, but this is not Michelangelo's God. This was the last thing he painted before having the scaffold disassembled and him fleeing Rome. I like to think something happened to him when he saw this from the floor. The first time he had seen his work from the floor since the incident surrounding the flood and Zechariah. From the moment he comes back, figures are much larger. God soars above us down the vault. He's not this blonde guy standing, feet on the ground, making a classical Renaissance gesture. He is a supreme being, flying to and fro, hurling balls of fire. When they dragged Michelangelo back to complete the work, something had changed. It's as if he felt completely free for the first time to do exactly what he wished. The Temptation and Fall is the last of the large panels Michelangelo painted before fleeing Rome. He left a snippy note for the Pope: let Raphael finish it. His physical health was declining. He was exhausted, broke, and determined never to return to Rome. It is a vast single panel with Adam and Eve mirrored, but also transformed on the opposite side. The knowledge they have sought has transformed their beauty and grace into pain and suffering. The panel is an equation. The snake is the only other figure present, and the snake is a philosophical construct. An image that deals with the loftiest and most complicated question in the entire historical record of the idea of good and evil, because the snake becomes the angel. On one side, an arm extends, giving Eve the fruit, the other casting them out. It's important to note that Adam is himself picking the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and it is not Eve who is tempting him here. While the Bible blames Eve, Michelangelo was the first to depict them both bearing equal responsibility in their fall. If anything, the snake is tempting Eve. Adam, he's just going for it. Characteristic of classical art, notice too that here nature pre-echoes history, and death is already present in the rotted, shriveled stump beside Eve. It matches the pose of her arm. And Eve, she is in a very interesting pose, a sexual embrace of Adam that has been interrupted by the snake. The sexual inferences of lust give way to the cardinal sin of pride for both him and her. In this fresco, Michelangelo has confronted the moral tragedy of the human race. Without knowledge, we know and feel nothing but ourselves. But with knowledge, we suffer and become capable of empathetic reasoning. Suffering brings with it awareness of compassion through the burden of consciousness, and this is what makes us human. This is the sacrifice of Noah, depicted as Noah, his wife, and family sacrificing 2 rams. So the sacrifice was to thank God for protecting them in the deluge. It's a bit out of order on the ceiling, but I'm sure Michelangelo wanted to save the larger panel for the flood. I do find it odd that he's saved 2 of every animal on the ark, and then the first thing that he and his family does is sacrifice a bunch of them, lining them up for the slaughter. I feel this is summed up best in the facial expression of the ox in the background left. That there is some 21st century meme material. This is the first large bay that Michelangelo created. It is very busy, containing more than 60 figures. He really relied on his assistants, since he was no painter and not versed in fresco. There are so many figures, so much is going on. You really miss a lot of this from the floor. Like the father holding his drowned son, or the tiniest white dove in the window of the ark. Rain and wind beat down on the lot as they flee the storm, some carrying all their worldly possessions. As mentioned in the guided tour, when Michelangelo took apart the scaffold to see this from the ground, he was furious. He had relied on experts to help him, and here they guided him to make something barely discernible from the floor. Here we witness the fall of man again. Noah, in his fall, echoes Adam in his birth. Take a look at the similarity of the 2 figures. One of Noah's sons is trying to compassionately cover his humiliated, drunken father, while the other 2 laugh and mock him. This is a profound statement about humankind that has weathered the ages. Only 1 in 3 has compassion. The rest are just going to stand and laugh at you. You've clicked on one of the prophets or pagan Greek symbols. During the Renaissance, there was a rekindled interest in classical art, but also classical ideas. There was a newborn fascination with pre-Christian religions, and while this was an exploration of pagan symbolism, it was often shoehorned into somehow supporting Christianity as the only true religion. The Hebrew prophets and Greek symbols both spoke on behalf of a god, and some of their prophecies did foretell the coming of a savior, so that kind of worked. The symbols' geographical names reveal the range of their mission. If you look up, Greece is represented by the Delphic symbol, Ionia and Asia by the Eritrean and Persian symbols, Africa by the Egyptian or Libyan symbol, and Rome in the center by the symbol from Cumea. Michelangelo interleaved them with the prophets to create an incredibly strong unifying visual theme. It should be noted that no artist had previously put the symbols on equal footing with the prophets like this. To better understand the images Michelangelo used, one must understand his influences, and the fiery Florentine preacher Savonarola was chief among them. I say fiery because he was a dramatic orator, but also because the Vatican burnt him alive for disagreeing with them. In one of his most famous sermons, Savonarola cited the 7 divine forces of the Holy Spirit from the prophecy of Isaiah: wisdom and understanding, deliberation and might, science and compassion, and above all, fear of the Lord. The celebrated art historian Edgar Wendt was the first to notice that these align in order with the 7 prophets on the ceiling. Zechariah represents wisdom, Joel, intelligence, Isaiah, deliberation, Ezekiel, might, Daniel, science, Jeremiah, compassion, and Jonah, fear of the Lord. The figures are also arranged in an order that complements one another. Jonah's defiant turbulence calls for its complement in the Peace of Zechariah. Daniel and the Eritrean Sibyl are both gifted in interpretation, though one in science and one in tongues. Ezekiel and Cumea are the most powerful figures on the vault. Seated in the center, they anchor everything with their power and stability. You can now inspect individual figures to learn more about them. These bronze medallions continue the story from Abraham to the Book of the Maccabees from the Apocrypha. It's believed that Julius wanted to draw a direct connection between himself, the warrior pope, and those warrior priests of the Old Testament. However, it should be said that Michelangelo probably didn't paint these, and they didn't seem like much of a priority. It looks like he even let go whomever was in charge of painting them towards the end of the project. You can see that the last few are in an unfinished state, and then the last one is just completely empty. And he was right. We really don't care. I mean, you probably wouldn't have noticed unless I had just pointed it out. Apparently, decorating flat walls with realistically painted drapery was a big thing back in the 1400s. Only a 600-year wait for normal mapping and displacement. Ah, there we go. SIGGRAPH joke. I know, I said I wouldn't say anything about the Last Judgment. I guess this is an Easter egg. Michelangelo, age 67, was painting the Last Judgment on this altar wall, and a Vatican official, the master of ceremonies, Biagio de Cesena, saw it at a stage of completion. He told everyone of the nudes and said that the work was unfit for the Holy Chapel, that it was more fit for the walls of a tavern or a bathhouse. As the master of ceremonies, Cesena would walk through this door almost daily, so Michelangelo decided to paint a caricature of Cesena above it, as Minos, the king of hell, who judges the dead as they enter. As if to say, you want to judge me? Yeah, okay, here, I'll make you a judge for eternity. And here he is to this day, ears like a jackass, a serpent wound tightly around him, chomping down on his genitals. This scene certainly bears witness to Michelangelo's religious belief in an absolute creator, majestic and severe in his final judgment. This is the actual aerial work platform that the Vatican conservators used to inspect the scene. Hold on, we're going to teleport up there. You can now press the touchpad to move around at this height. If you'd like to learn about the cleaning and restoration, click the dirty spandrel that is lit with a spotlight. To teleport back down, click on the chapel floor.